We scour ancient texts, looking for hidden codes, mathematical anomalies, and divine signatures. In the modern digital landscape, we are obsessed with the idea that the intersection of ancient scripture and digital folklore holds apocalyptic secrets waiting to be decoded. But what if the human psychological drive to uncover secret knowledge, a modern echo of ancient Gnosticism, has completely blinded us to the truth? What if the greatest mysteries of the ancient world were never meant to be solved by supercomputers or statistical algorithms, but were instead forged in the visceral, terrifying historical realities of the ancient Near East? The true mysteries of antiquity are far more complex, dangerous, and fascinating than the sanitized myths that have replaced them. To understand them, we must strip away the modern fabrications and step back into a world where holding a specific belief was an act of treason. Our journey into the real code of antiquity begins with the most infamous cryptographic puzzle in human history. 666. It is the number of the beast, universally recognized and endlessly feared. For generations, speculative interpreters have pointed to this figure in Revelation 13:18 as a prophetic warning of modern technology, linking it to barcodes, microchips, or contemporary political figures. But a rigorous examination of the text reveals that this number is not a crystal ball gazing into the 21st century. It is a highly specific first-century geopolitical cipher, and the mechanics of its true meaning were unearthed not in a modern laboratory, but in the suffocating dust of an ancient Egyptian rubbish dump. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the blistering heat beat down on archaeologists Bernard Pine Grenfell and Arthur Surridge Hunt as they excavated a site at Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. Beneath the dirt and the debris of forgotten lives, they uncovered thousands of papyri that provided an unprecedented window into the ancient world. Among these discarded fragments was a highly damaged manuscript of the New Testament, designated as Papyrus 115. Paleographic analysis dated this fragile, fading document to the 3rd century, somewhere between 225 and 275 AD, making it the oldest surviving manuscript witness to the text of Revelation 13. But it wasn't until the late 1990s, when the manuscript was finally deciphered and published, that it stunned the academic world. The ink on the papyrus did not record the number of the beast as 666. Instead, the Greek numerals laid out a different sequence entirely: 616. This wasn't an isolated anomaly, or a simple slip of a scribe's pen. The 2nd century church father Irenaeus had actually mentioned the existence of this 616 variant in his work Against Heresies, and the highly significant Codex Ephremi Rescriptus also recorded the number as 616. This divergence in the ancient record is not a mistake. It is the ultimate skeleton key needed to unlock the true, terrifying identity of the beast. To comprehend why this matters, you must first understand the ancient practice of gematria. In the ancient Mediterranean world, alphabets did not possess a separate set of characters for numbers. Instead, the letters themselves doubled as numerical values, meaning every single word or name inherently carried a mathematical sum. The author of Revelation explicitly invites the reader to play this deadly game, stating, "Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man." Apocalyptic literature, like the Book of Revelation, was not meant for the oppressor. It was resistance literature, written by marginalized religious groups who were being crushed under the immense, unyielding weight of imperial power. Speaking out directly against the Roman emperor was an act of treason that guaranteed a brutal, agonizing execution. So these writers employed dense symbolism, bizarre imagery, and complex numerical ciphers. They needed to communicate subversive political critiques to their own communities while completely obfuscating their meaning from the Roman authorities who hunted them. And the overwhelming academic consensus identifies the target of this particular cipher as the architect of the first great Roman persecution, the Emperor Nero. Following the devastating Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, the Roman historian Tacitus records that Nero deflected the rumors of his own guilt by blaming the Christians. His punishments were the stuff of nightmares. Victims were subjected to horrific tortures, crucified, mauled to death by dogs, and burned alive to serve as human torches illuminating the emperor's gardens at night. The identification of this tyrant is locked in through the mechanics of Hebrew gematria. If you take the Greek spelling of Nero's imperial title, Neron Caesar, and transliterate it into Hebrew characters, the math aligns with chilling perfection. The letters Nun, Resh, Waw, Nun, Kof, Samech, and Resh add up exactly to 666. But the extraordinary significance of Papyrus 115 is how it provides staggering linguistic confirmation of this exact hypothesis. If a copyist operating in a Latin-speaking environment used the Latin pronunciation of the emperor's name, Nero Caesar, and transliterated that form into Hebrew, the final nun in Neron is dropped. That specific Hebrew letter carries a numerical value of exactly 50. Subtract 50 from 666, and you are left with precisely 616. The variant reading wasn't a mathematical error. It was a linguistically localized translation of the exact same geopolitical cipher. It proves that the early Christians universally understood the beast to be none other than the tyrannical emperor Nero. But the scribes of Papyrus 115 added one final, profound layer of textual resistance. Paleographers noted that the Greek numerals for 616 were written with a specific overline styling. This wasn't just grammatical. It visually mimicked the nomina sacra, the sacred abbreviations heavily utilized by early Christian scribes to designate divine names like Jesus and Christ. In this light, the number of the beast transforms from a mere mathematical identifier into a grotesque visual parody. The mark visually mocks the name of Christ, reflecting Rome's blasphemous claim to ultimate divine authority, demanding the worship that belonged solely to God. The authentic codes of antiquity reveal a world of danger and defiance. But as the centuries passed, the human brain's desire to find patterns would lead modern readers to fabricate illusions far removed from history. And the deepest of these modern illusions would be found hidden within the very letters of the text itself. We are hardwired by evolution to see ghosts in the static. It is a primal survival mechanism, an ancient biological quirk born in the tall, wind-swept grass of our ancestors, where failing to recognize the subtle pattern of a predator meant a sudden, violent death. But in the modern, insulated era, this hyperactive pattern recognition engine has turned inward. It feeds on our deepest theological anxieties and existential fears. We call this phenomenon pareidolia, the psychological glitch of perceiving profound, undeniable meaning in completely random or ambiguous stimuli. When this biological flaw is pointed at the clouds, we see faces. But when it is weaponized by modern technology and pointed at ancient sacred texts, it generates a deeply seductive mathematical illusion that has captured the minds of millions. We want so desperately to find a divine signature, a hidden message meant only for us, that we are willing to force the universe into a shape it was never meant to hold. And nowhere is this psychological trap more prevalent and more mathematically devastating than in the modern obsession with the Bible code. The truth waiting at the bottom of these algorithms is not a message from the divine. It is a dark, reflective mirror, showing us our own desperate desire to control the unknown. The trap begins with a promise of absolute mathematical certainty. Proponents of what is known as the equidistant letter sequence, or ELS, claim that beneath the surface text of the Hebrew Bible lies a vast, multidimensional cryptographic puzzle authored by God himself. They point specifically to the haunting prophetic words of Isaiah 53, a text depicting the agonizing suffering of a divine servant. The claim is intoxicating in its simplicity and its profound implications. They argue that if you take the original Hebrew text and count every 49th letter, skipping across the ancient parchment like a stone, skipping across a dark, silent river, a hidden phrase emerges from the matrix of characters. That phrase is Yeshua Shmi, which translates to Jesus is my name. To the untrained eye, to the desperate believer looking for empirical, undeniable proof in a chaotic world, this feels like an absolute miracle. It feels like a cryptographic signature embedded in the ink centuries before the historical Jesus ever walked the dusty roads of the Levant, lying dormant until the age of supercomputers could finally unlock its secrets. When this theory was popularized in a 1994 academic paper, it exploded into mainstream consciousness. It felt like the ultimate, final victory of faith over modern skepticism. But beneath the pristine surface of this mathematical parlor trick lies a fundamental, catastrophic misunderstanding of both probability and ancient linguistics. The entire illusion of the equidistant letter sequence relies on the false, unhistorical assumption that the biblical text has remained a static, mathematically perfect grid of letters since the very moment it was penned by the prophets. It demands an idealized, non-historical version of the Masoretic text that simply never existed in reality. The original autographs, the very papyri and scrolls touched by the authors, have long since been lost to the grinding decay of time and empire. The manuscripts that actually survived, preserved in the dry, echoing caves of Qumran and the silent, wind-battered monasteries of the Judean desert, are living, breathing, imperfect documents. They contain thousands of minor spelling variations, specifically regarding the ancient scribal use of matres lectionis, the consonants such as wa and yod, used to indicate long vowels. The addition, the omission, or the slight human alteration of even a single letter by a tired scribe in an ancient manuscript completely shatters the fragile 49-letter interval upon which the entire Isaiah code depends. But even more devastating than the reality of manuscript transmission is the cold, unfeeling law of large numbers. Biblical Hebrew is primarily a consonantal language where vowels are frequently omitted or simply implied by the reader's breath. This creates an incredibly elastic, flexible matrix of letters. In any sufficiently massive grid of text, if you allow a high-powered computer to search by skipping arbitrary varying intervals, it will inevitably, mathematically, yield thousands of coincidental matches. You are not finding a hidden divine message. You are simply witnessing the inevitable, statistical collision of probability. To prove the absolute absurdity of this cryptographic phenomenon, we must look away from the sacred scrolls and turn to the cold, computational wrath of a physicist named Brendan Mackay. Working alongside brilliant mathematicians, Mackay decided to turn the exact same Bible code algorithms, the very same mathematical engine used to find God in the book of Genesis, onto completely secular, mundane texts. He wanted to see what ghosts the machine would find hiding in the dark if it was fed a different script. The results were not just statistically significant, they were utterly terrifying. When the algorithm was fed a Hebrew translation of Leo Tolstoy's sprawling epic, War and Peace, it generated hidden prophecies and encoded messages just as profound and statistically impossible as anything claimed by the biblical apologists. But Mackay didn't stop there. He turned the full power of the algorithm onto the classic English novel Moby Dick. English is a far more rigid language than Hebrew, due to the mandatory inclusion of vowels, making the extraction of hidden codes exponentially more difficult. Yet within the obsessive rhythmic prose of Herman Melville's tale of a white whale and a mad captain, the supercomputer found blood. The text of Moby Dick seemingly predicted the future with chilling, impossible accuracy. Intersecting with terrifying precision, the algorithm extracted complex, equidistant sequences predicting the brutal assassinations of some of the most prominent political figures in human history. Deep within the chapters of Moby Dick, the computer found the name of Abraham Lincoln intersecting flawlessly with the phrase, "shot dead," and the exact year of his violent demise. It scanned further and found John F. Kennedy, his name wrapped in eerie references to an assassination, the state of Texas, and a motorcade. It pulled the name of Martin Luther King Jr. from the static, intersecting the words "the Reverend" with "King," and the dark finality of death. It even found Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, his name crossing directly with the word assassin, and the exact name of his real-world killer, Amir. This specific discovery was a direct, devastating mockery of the apocalyptic authors who claimed that only the Bible could have predicted Rabin's death. The Moby Dick experiment proved once and for all that when you have a large enough text and a fast enough computer, numerical dates, descriptive verbs, and historical names will naturally cluster together purely by statistical probability. The equidistant letter sequence is not prophecy. It is pareidolia weaponized by processing power, a modern myth built entirely on the back of confirmation bias. But this desperate, exhausting hunger to force our own theological desires onto ancient texts does not stop at supercomputers. It infects how we read the very names of the ancients, twisting their identities to fit a narrative they never belonged to. This brings us to another pervasive, beautifully constructed lie that has spread across the digital landscape like a virus. It is the myth of the hidden gospel buried within the Genesis 5 genealogy. The popular claim asserts that if you take the names of the 10 ancient patriarchs from Adam to Noah and translate their Hebrew root meanings sequentially, a perfect, miraculous English sentence emerges summarizing the entire Christian message. Proponents passionately claim the sequence reads, "Man is appointed mortal sorrow. The blessed God shall come down, teaching that his death shall bring the despairing rest." It is undeniably elegant. It brings tears to the eyes of believers who see it as a divine watermark woven directly into the bloodline of humanity. But a strict, unflinching philological analysis of the ancient languages reveals this translation to be an extreme, almost grotesque manipulation of ancient Semitic roots. It relies heavily on a practice known as eisegesis, the intellectually dishonest method of reading modern theological desires backward into ancient texts, forcing the vocabulary of the past to submit to the dogmas of the present. The linguistic deception begins subtly, tricking the reader because the first few names in the sequence do possess clear, uncontested translations that fit the narrative. Adam derives from Adamah, meaning humanity, or the red clay of the earth. Seth denotes appointed or substituted, and Enosh simply means mortal man. But as the genealogy progresses deeper into the ancient past, the etymological methodology completely collapses into pure fabrication. Take the name Kenan. The internet myth aggressively translates it as sorrow to fit the emotional arc of their manufactured sentence. But in authentic ancient Hebrew, it derives from a root meaning a nest, a dwelling, or even a smith and metalworker. Translating it as sorrow is entirely unsupported by any serious linguistic record. The deception becomes truly egregious with the patriarch Methuselah. The myth claims his name means his death shall bring. But Methuselah is a compound of the word mut, meaning man, and shalach, meaning dart, spear, or weapon. His name translates accurately to the man of the dart or the man of the weapon. To bend a violent, ancient warrior's title into a prophetic, sacrificial phrase about bringing death is an academic crime. And the name Lamech, claimed to mean the despairing, actually has no unused root in biblical Hebrew at all. Comparative Semitic linguistics, looking at Arabic cognates, point to it meaning a robust, powerful, or strong young man. When you strip away the forced syntax, when you ruthlessly remove the fabricated meanings designed to engineer a predetermined theological outcome, the actual sequence reads closer to humanity, appointed a mortal dwelling. The praise of God descends, dedicated. The man of the dart is robust, finding rest. It does not form a cohesive, localized English sentence summarizing a future religion. To string disparate names together across centuries of time to form a neat, modern theological summary violates the entire structural integrity of ancient Near Eastern genealogical records. The ancient Hebrews did place massive, profound significance on the naming of individuals. Names reflected the visceral circumstances of birth, the harsh realities of their environment, or their prophetic destinies. They were markers of identity in a brutal, unforgiving world. They were never meant to be puzzle pieces in a forced, ungrammatical code. Yet, this constant, exhausting need to manufacture proof of the divine extends even beyond the text, reaching deep into the very biological fabric of our bodies, where the line between theology and biological pseudoscience becomes dangerously blurred. There is a deep psychological comfort in the idea that the Creator signed his work, leaving a physical fingerprint on the human machine. This desire has birthed the viral pseudoscientific claim that human DNA and specific cellular proteins contain irrefutable visual proof of the divine. You will hear passionate claims that the numerical sequence of DNA bases forms a repeating 10-5-6-5 pattern, supposedly held together by sulfuric bridges, perfectly matching the Hebrew gematria for the sacred name of God, Yahweh. It is a compelling cinematic story, but it is a total biological fabrication. Human DNA base pairs are held together by hydrogen bonds, not sulfuric bridges. Human DNA does not contain sulfur in its structural backbone. and that mathematically perfect interval is completely arbitrary and entirely non-existent in real genetic biochemistry. But an even more visual, emotionally manipulative myth centers around a vital protein called laminin. Laminin is a crucial glycoprotein of the extracellular matrix. It anchors our cells, providing the structural integrity that keeps human tissues from falling apart. And because introductory biology textbook diagrams frequently illustrate laminin in a simplified, extended cross shape to efficiently catalog its various binding sites along its four arms, an entire theological movement was born, claiming that God built the human body on the literal shape of the Christian cross. Pastors and internet apologists point to this two-dimensional textbook diagram and declare it the ultimate, undeniable empirical fulfillment of the ancient scripture, stating that in Him all things hold together. It is the absolute pinnacle of biological pareidolia. The terrifying reality, the beautiful, complex, and chaotic truth of human anatomy is that inside the living body, laminin does not look like a cross. In vivo, inside the dark, microscopic universe of your tissues, it adopts myriad, dynamic, twisted, fluid structures necessary to interact with other cellular components. It folds, it bends, it contorts to keep the wet machine of the human body functioning. When isolated and placed under the cold, objective lens of an electron microscope, laminin molecules are more commonly observed in an amorphous, chaotic tangle. Sometimes, due to the harsh artifacts of sample preparation, they even take on the horrific shape of a swastika. To hang the profound, cosmic philosophy of the ancient world on a highly idealized, flat rendering of a single protein is scientifically illiterate. It reduces the staggering, terrifying majesty of the universe to a cheap biological novelty. We are so afraid of the silence, so terrified of the vast, complex chaos of the natural world, that we will manipulate our sacred texts, our history, and even our own biology just to feel a false sense of control. But the true ancient mysteries are still waiting in the dark. They are not found in the comfortable patterns we project, but in the brutal, visceral history we have desperately tried to forget. We look to the infinite, freezing void of the cosmos to validate our most ancient beliefs, desperate for the unblinking eye of a supercomputer to confirm what the prophets whispered in the dark. For decades, a spectacularly persistent urban legend has echoed through church halls and internet forums, claiming that modern space scientists at NASA stumbled upon a terrifying, impossible glitch in the astronomical calendar. The story asserts that while running complex orbital mechanics simulations to map the trajectories of satellites, computers abruptly halted, identifying a missing day in the historical timeline of the universe. The narrative neatly packages this supposed 23-hour and 20-minute celestial discrepancy with a 40-minute reversal of a sundial found later in the biblical text, claiming it perfectly, mathematically corroborates the events of the book of Joshua, where the sun allegedly stood still over the battlefield. It is a story engineered for the modern mind, blending the sterile, undeniable authority of space-age technology with ancient battlefield miracles. But the academic and historical reality is that this entire narrative is a ghost, a complete and absolute fabrication built on the fragile foundation of a misunderstood diesel mechanic. The man most frequently credited with this earth-shattering scientific discovery was a man named Harold Hill. He was not an astrophysicist. He was not an orbital mechanic. And he certainly was not charting the deep time of the cosmos. He was the president of a local engine company contracted to service the mundane, terrestrial backup diesel generators at the Goddard Space Flight Center. The official apparatus of NASA has repeatedly and explicitly disavowed this story, pointing out the glaring, elementary mathematical impossibility of the claim. To calculate missing time in the deep, unrecorded past, a computer requires a fixed, absolutely known prior temporal reference point, a baseline that simply does not exist anywhere in human historical records. The modern myth is nothing more than a regurgitated, technologically updated retelling of an obscure 1890 publication by a man named C.A.L. Totten, who used laughable, discredited methods to try and calculate the precise date of creation. Yet by clinging to this computerized fairy tale, we entirely miss the actual, terrifying psychological warfare that was unleashed on the ancient battlefield of Gibeon. To understand what truly happened when Joshua looked up at the sky, you must tear away the sterile lens of modern astronomy and plunge yourself into the superstitious, omen-obsessed cognitive environment of the ancient Near East. The Amorites, the formidable enemy coalition Joshua was fighting, did not view the sky as a vacuum of dead rocks. They viewed it as a living, breathing tapestry of divine communication. Academic analysis of Mesopotamian celestial omen texts reveals that these ancient armies relied heavily on astrology to dictate their military maneuvers. In their deeply held belief system, a perfect, propitious month was signaled when the sun and the moon stood in exact opposition, visible simultaneously on opposite horizons, on the 14th day of the lunar cycle. This alignment meant the gods favored them in battle. But if this exact celestial alignment occurred on the 15th day, it was interpreted as a profoundly negative omen, a cosmic guarantee of absolute, catastrophic military slaughter. On the morning of the battle, the biblical text explicitly notes that the sun was rising in the east over Gibeon, and the moon was setting in the west over Aijalon. Joshua was not asking for the sun to magically halt to give him more daylight to kill his enemies. It was already morning. He used a specific Hebrew word, damam, which in the technical, chilling context of ancient celestial omens means to wait or to stand in opposition. Joshua was commanding the celestial bodies to hold their terrifying positions and fall into opposition on the unpropitious 15th day. He was orchestrating a devastating, paralyzing psychological blow against an enemy that believed the very stars had just sentenced them to death. This is not a story about a paused rotation of the earth. It is a masterclass in ancient, atmospheric terror. We constantly sanitize the horrors of the ancient world, replacing the visceral smell of blood and burning flesh with neat, magical explanations that require no emotional toll. This desperate need to soften the blow of history is most painfully obvious in how we misremember the absolute apocalypse that befell the city of Jerusalem in the year 70 A.D. The ancient prophecy stated that not one stone of the magnificent temple would be left standing upon another. To explain this utter annihilation, modern commentators have popularized a mesmerizing cinematic fable. They claim that as the Roman legions torched the sacred sanctuary, The sheer, unimaginable heat of the inferno caused the temple's vast, unimaginable reserves of gold to melt into a liquid river, seeping deep into the cracks and crevices between the massive foundation stones. Driven by an insatiable, blinding greed, the Roman soldiers supposedly utilized immense leverage to pry every single stone apart to scrape out the hardened gold, thereby fulfilling the ancient prophecy in a perfectly mechanical, almost magical fashion. It is a story of divine consequence wrapped in human greed, but it is entirely absent from any primary historical record of the event. It is a much later, sanitized apologetic embellishment designed to force a hyper-literal fulfillment of prophecy, while shielding the reader from the true, unspeakable nightmare that actually leveled the city. The actual history of the siege, meticulously documented by the first-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, requires absolutely no mythological gold to convey the sheer, crushing magnitude of the devastation. The true horror did not come from the Roman battering rams on the outside, but from the total, catastrophic psychological and social collapse of the people trapped within the suffocating walls. As the Roman general Titus encircled the city, sealing off any hope of escape or resupply, rival zealot factions inside Jerusalem plunged the holy city into a vicious, blood-soaked civil war. Led by brutal figures like Simon Bar Giora and John of Giscala, these factions actively burned their own desperately needed food supplies to force the populace to fight the Romans, plunging the city into absolute, maddening starvation. Josephus records a famine so severe, so dehumanizing, that armed gangs of starving men would slit throats over the mere scent of cooking grain. They looted the bodies of the dying, and in their agonizing madness, they gnawed on the leather of their belts, their shoes, and the dry, cracked coverings of their shields, just to have something to swallow. The prophecy of destruction was not fulfilled by gold-crazed soldiers. It was fulfilled by a society devouring itself alive from the inside out. The situation inside the walls descended into an abyss of human depravity so harrowing that even the hardened, blood-soaked veterans of the Roman army shuddered when they heard the whispers of what was happening. It culminated in the terrifying reality of a woman named Mary of Bethazuba. She was a wealthy refugee who had fled to the city for safety, only to have her home repeatedly plundered, her remaining morsels of food ripped from her hands by the roaming zealot gangs. Driven entirely and irrevocably mad by the hollow ache of starvation, Mary experienced a complete psychological rupture. In an act of unparalleled desperation, she looked at the infant son crying at her breast, murdered him, roasted his fragile body over a fire, and consumed half of his flesh. When the violent zealots smelled the scent of cooked meat wafting into the street, they burst through her doors, their weapons drawn, demanding she surrender her hidden feast. With the hollow, dead eyes of a woman who had lost everything, she presented the gruesome remains of her own child to the murderous men. She looked at them and spoke words that would echo in infamy, stating, "This is my own child and my own handiwork. Eat, for I have eaten already." The zealots, men who had spent months casually slaughtering their own neighbors, dropped their weapons and fled the house in absolute, trembling terror. This is the grim, visceral reality that grounds the ancient texts. It is not magical melting gold. It is the devastating consequence of war, extreme political rebellion, and the terrifying depths of human depravity when the walls close in. Even when we look at the most complex, mathematically structured prophecies of the ancient world, we force our modern obsession with linear timelines onto texts that were written as desperate survival manuals. The Book of Daniel contains a mysterious, haunting prophecy concerning 70 weeks, a timeline that modern interpreters eagerly calculate out to precisely 490 years. By starting a stopwatch at a specific decree in ancient Persia, they claim this countdown ticks flawlessly across the centuries, arriving at the exact year of the crucifixion, leaving one final terrifying 7-year week suspended in the future as a period of global apocalypse. But the overwhelming consensus of historical biblical scholarship rips this prophecy out of the distant future and plunges it into the immediate existential terror of the 2nd century BC. This text was forged in the fires of the Maccabean crisis, a period when the very existence of the Jewish people hung by a thread under the boot of a tyrant named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He did not just conquer the land, he attempted to erase their identity, outlawing their ancient practices, criminalizing the Sabbath, and threatening circumcised children with slaughter. He marched into the sacred heart of the Second Temple, erected a blasphemous altar to the Greek god Zeus, and sacrificed swine upon it, staining the holy stones with forbidden blood in an event universally recognized as the abomination of desolation. In the suffocating darkness of this oppression, the 70 weeks were not a simple math equation. They were a symbolic structure built on the ancient concept of Jubilee cycles to provide structure to redemptive history. The timeline spans the agonizing centuries from the Babylonian exile through the grueling rebuilding of the city, right up to the very moment their world was shattered again. The mysterious Anointed One, who is violently cut off in the text, does not point centuries forward. It points directly to the bleeding corpse of Onias III, the last legitimate righteous high priest of their era. He was deposed by his own corrupt Hellenizing brother and murdered in the shadows in 171 BC, plunging the nation into chaos. The final terrifying week of the prophecy covers the exact 7-year period of maximum bloodshed, from the assassination of the priest to the horrifying desecration of the temple, ending only when the Maccabean rebels finally cleansed the sanctuary in 164 BC. Understanding this text through the lens of actual history elevates it from a mere puzzle to be solved into a profound, defiant work of resistance. It was whispered in caves and hidden rooms to assure a tortured people that the tyrant's clock was ticking, and that his time was strictly limited by a sovereign God. The fact that later generations reused these apocalyptic images to describe the Romans only proves the point. The ancient scribes understood history as a cycle of rising empires and repeating tyrannies, a relentless theological pattern of oppression and survival. We are terrified of the dark, and we are even more terrified of the chaos of human history. We obsessively search ancient scrolls for mathematical codes, secret biological signatures, and hidden space-age calendar alignments, because a God who writes in equations is predictable, safe, and controllable. But the devastating irony is that in our desperate attempt to scientifically prove the magic of these texts, we completely strip them of their true, visceral power. The real mystery is not found in an arbitrary hidden word sequence. It is found in the terrifying resilience of the human spirit. The sacred texts were not written by computers predicting the future. They were carved in the blood and ashes of starving mothers, murdered priests, and terrified armies reading the sky. We worship the sterile certainty of a digital prophecy, completely blind to the fact that the actual salvation of the ancient world was forged in the absolute darkest, most horrific pits of human suffering. We want the neat, painless math problem, but history only offers the butcher's bill. It forces us to look in the mirror and ask a fundamental question about our own existence. Do you choose the comfortable, sanitized lie of the machine, or the dangerous, blood-stained truth of history? The next era of humanity will belong to those who can stomach the latter. Subscribe to witness the final chapter.